Robert Brockway suggests that humanity's greatest threat is itself, and also parasitic space aliens. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. And I do have a bit of a doozy for you today. And it's also Spooktober, so I wanted to focus on some horror. Today's book is definitely chock full of that horror and a lot of dread as well. Today's story is all about murder and the end of humanity and space aliens, as I've said before. I am referring to Carrier Wave by Robert Brockway, which was published in 2020. For those who don't know, Robert Brockway is an American writer, a white American writer. He's been writing since the mid-2000s, but he really got his start writing for sort of online publications like Cracked, which I was familiar with. I saw a lot of his early writing there, and he currently works for like 1-800-HOT-DOG, which is a sort of spiritual successor to Cracked after it was bought by hedge fund companies or something like that. And in addition to that, he also writes science fiction and fantasy type stories, horror type stories as well. Written a couple series, but also some general standalone horror stories. From what I've read, which is just this book so far, I really like his writing, and I definitely want to read more of what he has to offer. Carrier Wave is probably one of the best books that I've read in a while, and especially one of the best horror books as well. But I don't need to qualify. It's just like one of the best books. So I'm definitely going to recommend it, and I'll talk more about why I liked it in a few moments. But I should also note that I'll try to avoid spoiling things in the summary section here. Just try to talk broadly, but I might spoil things in the analysis section, so be on the lookout for that. So I just urge you to go out, read this, and then come back and watch this video once you're finished, so that we might have a discussion. But without further ado, let's talk about Carrier Wave. I'll do that summary and a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Carrier Wave focuses on a bunch of different characters. It's more structured like a series of short stories about an underlying event happening to multiple people, rather than a strict sort of narrative following one person through that set event. But it begins with a group of three sort of astronomical researchers, SETI researchers, discovering a strange pattern from space that produces an unusual sound. And after like at least two of them listen to it, they begin ranting and going into like a violent rage and attacking people, eventually being killed in the process. But one of the other researchers realizes that the rage has something to do with the sound, and so they begin experimenting with it and subjecting other people to it, which becomes about in different ways. It's expressed in different ways in each person, and they begin categorizing people based on that. And it gets so bad that eventually the CDC and a bunch of soldiers are called in to quarantine this area, putting people in a hospital. Unfortunately, one of the doctors becomes infected by the sound and responds by burning down the entire hospital, mainly to prevent people from figuring out what's happening here. And then a short while later, a young man named Jeff, who likes to make music, decides to what he does is he takes some music files that a friend gave him from the military, and just starts making music with it. And he pulls the sound file that is related to this mysterious pattern and decides to put it into a song. He uploads it to a forum as well as YouTube, and it becomes massively popular. But as time goes on, people begin sending him comments on these forums that don't make any sense, and people are sort of like yelling at him and filled with a violent rage. The the result is that, like, Jeff eventually turns on the news and finds out that the world has gone into riots. People are killing each other and times are not good, and Jeff responds by sort of listening to the sound again and realizing that he, like, sort of spread this. He was compulsed to share it, to become a herald for this, for these alien beings which are coming to Earth to sort of harvest humanity for an unknown reason. And Jeff realizes it's all his fault, basically, and so he kills himself, which is unfortunate. Then a black spot begins to grow in the sky. Anyone who looks at it becomes filled with rage or exhibits different characteristics. And so people are urged not to look at the sky. There's a chapter on a young girl named Mari, who her brother is infected, and he attempts to try to kill her for not following the rules. And she takes her other younger brother, and they run off to a military base where their father is supposed to be. Unfortunately, he died, and the military tries to take him in, but they're attacked by these forces which are now amassing together, these sort of maniac type people. And Mari is able to escape with the help of a sort of snake, a land tank, a land train of sort that the military used as an experimental weapon, and they're able to sort of go through the landscape and help other people at that point. Years begin to pass and the skies grow darker. There's no sun anymore. The animals can't really sense that anymore. Like the sun is still there for them as well as plants, because you can still grow things. It just seems like it's an apocalypse for humans in particular. But people begin hearing rumors of a walled city that offers protection and a white tower sort of in the distance that and nobody's really sure what it is. But given that every other maniac has dark eyes, they figure that might be sort of like an antithesis to the black-eyed creatures who are no longer human. The people discover that the walled city is protected by these judges who follow the law very strictly and are kind of vaguely related to the alien creatures. The snake manages to soldiers on board the snake, the land train, manage to capture a white-eyed man who's not dark-eyed like the rest, and the white-eyed man basically reveals the plan of these aliens and how humanity can possibly be saved. And then as time goes on, giant monsters and these alien godlike creatures arrive and begin killing and massacring many people. Eventually they make their way to the walled city, both humans and these monster creatures alike, and there's a big old fight for control of this walled city and for the destruction of humanity. Ultimately there are survivors of this, and they try to pass down the message of what they've learned from all of this to future generations, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit we're talking about with Carrier Wave. Very fascinating horror story, one that I haven't really seen the like of before. I've seen a lot of people post like creepypastas that had a similar idea, but Brockway seems to be one of the first people to kind of elaborate on this idea. And so one of the main themes is that of virality. So Brockway has written a zombie narrative, but instead of using the zombie bite as a means of infection, he's kind of utilized sound and sight as one of the causes for the propagation of what's going on in this story. So you see that initially with the SETI sound pattern, the researchers discovering the sound and being driven by madness, and one of them is even sort of obsessed with like sharing that sound so that they can spread it, and then even the person, the young man Jeff, who's making music, realizes too late that he was compulsed to really share this sound, and that he's responsible in part for the destruction of humanity. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "There it is, the thing that crawled inside my head and made me do this. I didn't find a cool sample and build a song around it. I caught a parasite and it took over, forcing me to build a Trojan horse for an army of psychic monstrosities," which is a very interesting passage. But again, there's this parasite that gets inside your head and forces you to share this this so that other people can be infected. Even the creatures that are sort of affected by the seeing the giant dark spot in the sky, like they force you to look at it as well so that you can be infected. And then there's also YouTube virality in this story where like posting the song online generates more and more views, especially on the forum where it's posted. And so there's a large spread, a lot of people becoming involved and sharing and like having to deal with this sort of virus, as you would imagine. It's not necessarily a physical sickness like the flu, but it is a virus of the mind that drives you mad. There's a manic compulsion to share the horrors and the knowledge as well, because like the white-eyed creature, to the person who's asking questions of the white-eyed creature on the train, like the white-eyed creature like grabs onto that person and sort of shares their knowledge through their eye, which leads that person forever changed. And so there's a desire to constantly share and spread their knowledge or like these feelings, these intents, which leads to further horrors down the road. Now, it's very interesting, like as I mentioned before, like this is similar to a zombie outbreak, but it's also important to know when it was written, which was 2020, and what was happening and still happening in the world at that time is COVID, where COVID was massively spreading. And I can see how maybe Brockway was sort of seeing that and was maybe inspired to write a sort of COVID narrative without actually using the idea, or like without actually using the illness of COVID, like writing something similar and showing the downfall or destruction of humanity in the process. So I do like the sort of parallels that Brockway is showing there. Another thing that Brockway is writing about here is intent and abstractions. So like concepts more so than anything else, but also the intent behind those concepts. So the horror partly stems from the intangible nature of the evil gods in the story. It's eventually revealed that the evil gods are abstractions. They're concepts. They're the concept of justice, the concept of happiness, the concept of anger, of rage, of peace, or something like that. And so rather than being tangible alien-like beings, they're just these concepts that have been gifted to humanity, and now it's time for the reaping, where the concepts, these beings, are going to like harvest the human beings and then like farm them again for a later period down the road. It's kind of bizarre that's what the aliens are like. It's something I've never really come across. So a lot of credit for Brockway to kind of imagine such alien beings, whereas most people would think of these tangible humanoid-like creatures. And it's also scary because humans are essentially being targeted for their aspirations. At least one being says, like you looked to the sky and that's what caused your problems, because there's the obviously the sound pattern, but there's the black spot in the sky. So looking and aspiring for greater things is what led to some of these problems. And like there are people who are like, oh, humanity's great because we have all these aspirations, we understand all these concepts like justice and whatnot, but these, as the aliens say, like they're only gifts. Like they were granted to us. So ultimately, below the surface, humans are nothing but Neanderthal type creatures, as we might think of them: violent, overbearing, extremely aggressive, and prone to impulses more so than anything else. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. If your fellow man forgets what peace is now and knows only rage, it is not because we took something from him. It is because we stopped giving something to him. The maniacs, as you call them, are simply humanity in its natural form. The purest strain absence our interference. You and the others like you who remain unaffected by our presence have simply interbred so thoroughly that our concepts have been inexorably mixed within you. And so that's a very fascinating sort of passage, really something that made me stop and think for a couple minutes there as I was reading it. And I think what the alien creature at this part is suggesting is that humans are inherently violent, that when you take away these gifts that were granted, all you have is a species that is prone to violence and fighting one another, and that like we were only gifted these concepts by some higher power, which can very easily just take it away. So is humanity just inherently violent? Is that all our species is good for? And then furthermore, other questions arise, like what is justice? What is true justice? What is anger? And I think a lot of the problems that originate in the story is that you have too much of one thing. Like some of the alien creatures that possess humans in the story or something like that, the problem is there's too much justice focused one way, and then there's a rapid switch the other way as well for some of these other concepts. And so too much of one way or not enough moderation, which as the alien creature says is like you intermix these concepts with other things, which is useful. But like if you only focus on justice and it's like everyone is treated the same regardless, then you end up with a couple of problems, and you lead to the violence and anger and the almost total destruction of humanity that you see in this story. So it does seem like Brockway is somewhat pessimistic of humanity in this story, that he's seeing all the violence that might have taken place in 2020 and continues to this day, and it's just like, yeah, humanity seems doomed. The fundamental base nature of the human being is to enact violence on one another. And so again, like another question might be, like what's the truly horrifying situation in this story? Is it that humans are doing this to themselves, that human beings are just like this? Or is it that some other alien species is capable of making us this way, of completely wrecking our civilization? And that's all about intent. That's the abstract human concepts. And that abstraction provides a little bit more horror because you can't really feel it. You can't really see justice. But you know what it looks like when someone isn't given justice, or when someone is mad and is focusing that anger on you. Robert Brockway also utilizes a lot of existential dread in this story. It was kind of giving me a little bit of panic attacks as I was reading it throughout the story, especially when I got to the part where the white-eyed sort of creature was talking about all of this and how humanity thinks that it's great, but it's actually only gifts that we were given. The thought of that is kind of alarming because, again, if we're only given these gifts, then what does that say about humanity? And like obviously that doesn't sound like it's the case in real life, but just to be in that kind of mindset is very alarming. But in this story, there is the overwhelming sense that humanity is doomed, that we've come across a problem that we cannot fix, that is tapping into some real problem that has always existed in humanity, and now it's gotten way too much out of our control. And there seems to be no winning here, because how do you defeat these abstract concepts? How do you defeat humanity that can't be destroyed? Because a lot of these humans, like they don't respond to bullets, and they seem to be smarter and more malicious than you, and so there's no real fighting those people. And at this point, like especially at the end of the story, like it doesn't really seem like humanity can survive because too many humans have been killed, and reproduction requires a lot more in the gene pool and the availability of reproduction pool and whatnot. But besides that as well, humanity seems scarred in a greater sense, because at the end of the story, they start talking about how like you can't look to the sky and humanity can only be allowed to progress so far, which seems like the wrong kind of lesson to learn here. But there might also be a point to that. Don't just be blindly aspirational. Understand where you're going and have control over what's going on so that people aren't left behind. But more so than that you're not like falling into any sort of trap. But it does seem like humans are greatly scarred by this, and it might affect how civilization goes forward, if it is even able to go forward. And ultimately, I think what the point of all of this is that Brockway suggests that humanity is it's the biggest threat to itself. Like as much as you got animals and asteroids and other sorts of things, the biggest threat to itself is humans. Humans cause their own destruction at times. The snake in this story, the land train or something like that, like people refer to it as the Ouroboros, which, if you recall, the Ouroboros is a snake that eats itself. So essentially, kind of alluding to the fact that humanities lead to their own destruction, that they cause their own greatest pain. And as I mentioned before, like, either we do this to ourselves, like either we are the cause of our own destruction, or again, aliens are capable of doing that to us. And that's a good sense of existential dread, because either we're going to just kill ourselves straight off, without being able to, elevate humanity to a better point, or we're going to eventually, discover a species beyond the stars that wants us dead, and we have no control over that. Like Cthulhu, like Lovecraftian kind of horror, but I don't think you see as much Lovecraft in this story. A little bit, but Lovecraft gets around, I would say. But yeah, like, it's the ultimate knowledge that humanity could either kill itself or will be destroyed by something that we are simply powerless to oppose. And all of this is really important because, again, the time period in which it was written, the year in which it was written. This was written in 2020, probably about 2019, but I do think a lot of 2020 influenced Robert Brockway. And so if you look at the world at that time, where you see like problems of COVID-19, the rise of fascism, global warming, pollution, other such problems, like you look at that and you're like, I don't believe humanity is capable of surviving such horrible things like this. What can humanity do when we're causing our own destruction, when we're hurting each other, when we're causing each other's greatest pains, and we're acting like a bunch of maniacs? Many of the riots in 2020 were justified, in my opinion, but that didn't stop it from, like, the riots from taking place in the first place, making it look like humanity was destroying everything around it. And so you could argue that they're like, Brockway is being extremely pessimistic about what's in store for humans, if they're even capable of making it out of this decade or the next, or if every problem that we've caused is eventually going to come back and bite us in the butt. Who really knows there? I would say there is kind of some hope in this story, especially at the end, where people work together to fight off this common threat, that the most important thing humans can do is come together as a collective unit. But again, that's kind of negated by some characters noting that, now that the uniting threat is gone, humans are going to go back to fighting themselves. So there's that great sense of pessimism. But there is a quote that happens at the end of the story, which is essentially, history is a curse, knowledge breaks it, which is an archivist talking to some children years after this event has taken place. And essentially what I think that quote means is, like, history is full of moments where bad things happen, and we are doomed to repeat history if we don't understand it. But, knowledge breaks that curse. Knowledge allows us to better understand what happened in history and make sure that it doesn't happen again, and to, take actions to make sure actual justice is being done. And so I think that there's kind of hope in that, in a way of defeating that existential dread. Brockway is being somewhat optimistic, even if he's mostly pessimistic in this story. He's leaving some room for hope, but ultimately, I think if you're a realist, you might say that maybe there might not be hope, because this could always happen again down the road, or history could just get the better of human beings, and we could fall into the same traps that we've done before and not really learn anything. But there is that attempt to learn something from this type of story, just like human beings can actually take in the lessons and work to create a better world through that. There are a number of good things as well as other bad things about this story. I do think Brockway does write amazing, well-crafted short stories, especially the chapter on Mari, where she's dealing with her brother and then she tries to make her way to the military base. It's a very tense chapter, very terrifying as well. Brockway does a great job of writing horror here, and also writing a lot of sort of Pyrrhic moments where there's like characters win, but at what cost, and they're ultimately killed. A lot of really sad moments like that. And then there's also a chapter that makes a lot of allusions to Die Hard, which I think is pretty cool. So a lot of variety of the type of stories that Brockway is writing here. But I do also think that some of these short stories leave you wanting more. Like, Brockway does such a great job of building these worlds and establishing these characters in the short time that he does stay with them. But you kind of want, like, the story to focus on those characters more and see what happens for the through line to their story, rather than just focusing on them for a short period of time and then moving on. And so I would just say, like, it's both a blessing and a curse here, but perhaps, I guess that's just a credit to Brockway's writing, because if he leaves you wanting more, then you'll come back for more, and also you've had an actual connection to what he's writing, even if it was a short story. And also, I just want to note the parallels to World War Z here. A lot. It's written in a very similar style, where you see basically the downfall of humanity and the possible rising and hope for humanity as well. And as well as noting, the reasons for that downfall, and the terrifying things learned about the oppressive force. In World War Z, it was about zombies. Here, it's these strange alien beings, and also a little bit of humanity. World War Z is one of my favorite books, so I was really happy that someone borrowed so heavily from it, but not so much that it's like the same story. There's definitely a lot of differences, that's probably for the best. It's good to be influenced without just directly taking from that sort of thing. So highly recommend reading both stories there. And then just one final thing is, I do think the story can be too doomy. In terms of all the awful, horrific, violent things that happen. Usually in horror, you want like maybe a moment of lightness or brevity, or not brevity, but like levity, I think. A moment of hope. And there's not a lot of moments of hope in this story, just a lot of destruction, people dying, families being ripped apart. And again, I guess that's the connection of forming an emotional attachment to these characters. But there's so much doom in this story that when humanity does come at the outer side, like it feels like it wasn't fully adhering to what was going on in the story, that is maybe too optimistic in the face of all the other horrific things that have happened to it. But maybe that's a commentary on, even during the worst of times, a little bit of humanity can survive, that humans are pushed forward. And maybe that's very similar to what Cormac McCarthy was saying in The Road, and that, yeah, it's the end of the world, but there's still people who are doing their best to survive, because humanity has to survive. It has to keep going forward, because we're not the kind of people to give up. Even though there might be some humans that do, ultimately the human spirit is what keeps us going in the wake of this horrific stuff. So again, a little bit of both. I can see there how it's good, but it's also it does kind of suck your soul as you're reading the story. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Carry Your Wave by Robert Brockway. Again, I would say it's probably one of the best books that I've read in recent memory. Definitely one of the better horror stories as well. I read a couple last year, but they didn't stand out as much as a book that I read a year previously, which was The Fisherman by John Langan, which I thought was a really stellar horror book. And I feel like Carry Your Wave is on the same level, but even beyond like horror, it's just good literature in general. I wasn't really expecting that, especially because Robert Brockway was a comedy writer, at least when I was reading him like 5 or so years ago. And here's a story that utilizes comedy a little bit, but it's mostly horror. It's mostly like a series horror narrative, and I wouldn't think that would be what Robert Brockway is like one of his strengths was, but it turns out that it is. So it's like absolutely amazing, and I'm very happy to have read it, and I do want to read more, and I highly recommend that you seek this out if you haven't done so already. It's definitely a great story that is worth your attention. Let me know if you read it before. You can leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about the author or this book if they don't already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about this book or other forms of media. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sound virus travels. Farewell.